let's get a 10-minute game and maybe a 5-minute game. And we'll see how it goes. So we have white here against its Vibe Hav. Good luck to our opponent. Let's start with e4. And we will get another Gleck system, hopefully. Although we faced a lot of Philidors at this level. Okay, knight c6, knight c3. So in this position, I think we face the sideline bishop to b4 once. Bishop to c5 is very common at this level. That does walk into the center fork trick. There we go. Bishop to c5 is on the board. So again, the reason I recommend people to watch the speedrun videos in succession is because the knowledge, not only does our rating climb and so the concepts become more complex, but the actual theory builds off of each other, right? So if you've been watching diligently, you might remember this move, and your reaction should be essentially automatic, which is to play knight takes c5. This is called the center fork trick. It's a very common theme across all openings, and we've already had it many times in the speedrun. And in this position, newer players really struggle with black to react properly. Now, a lot of you may know, and I've explained before, the proper reaction in order to keep the bishop pair is bishop to d6. It's essentially the only move that keeps a viable position for black. All other moves either lose the game quickly or lead to a much inferior position. Our opponent is aware of the proper response, bishop to d6. We take the knight, and here we're just sort of clearly better. We're not winning. It's not a blowout, but we're clearly better because, well, there's two main reasons. The sort of primitive reason is that we have better center control than black. We have three pieces that are all kind of clamping down on the d5 square. And also this bishop on e5 is quite an awkward piece. It's very vulnerable. Some of you might already be pining for f4. f4 is actually an inaccuracy, and this is an instructive moment. The reason f4 doesn't look great to me is because it allows bishop takes c3. But bishop takes c3 itself is not the problem, right? Because I'm not about to move my knight back. I'm not worried that black will take the knight because that gives up the bishop pair. I'm not worried about doubling the queenside pawns. As I've explained many times, we're probably going to castle kingside. So some damage, some visual damage to our queenside pawn structure is not a principal factor here. The bigger problem with the move f4 is that after the trade on c3, black plays a move like d6, and the pawn on f4 is actually a major liability. We want to be able to bring this bishop out to g5, not to g6, to g5 in response to the move knight f6, if that makes sense. So the move f4 actually hampers the development of the bishop, and it does create some weaknesses on the king side. It allows, nasty ideas like queen h4, so it's premature. Instead, we should develop our pieces, and we borrow an idea from the previous speedrun episode. Some of you might want to play bishop to c4 here, but the problem is that after black plays knight f6, the pawn on e4 starts to feel a little bit loose. So the best move here, I think, the move I want to play is not the sexiest move. It's not the move that looks the coolest. It's not the move that looks the most aggressive, but I think it's by far the most accurate way to play, and that is to put the bishop again on d3. We did this 2 games ago, and I'll show you the point where we did something similar. Black plays knight f6. Now we castle kingside. Clearly, there's no Greek gift sacrifice here because the g4 square is defended. And black castles as well. Okay, so at this point, what would you do? I think we might have even had this position before in the speedrun. And there is a very interesting idea. There's a kind of conventional move that we could play. And then there's a very interesting idea that you might have seen before in the Gleck system. I've introduced you to this idea. I don't think it works here, though. So the conventional move and the move we're going to play is bishop to g5, just developing our bishop. But as Denial Naroditsky points out in the chat, the interesting concept is to drop the knight back to e2. And suddenly we pull the chair out from under black because the bishop no longer has this bailout, and we're threatening to win a piece. We're threatening f4 and then e5. What is the problem with the move knight e2? What does a move like that allow? And if you calculate it concretely, black gets away, but barely. So what is the problem with dropping the knight back? Well, the problem is that we're relinquishing our control over the d5 square, so we're allowing the move d5, and you have to do some calculation there. Knight e2, black plays d5. We respond by pushing f4, and in that very messy position, unfortunately, black plays pawn takes e4. See if you can visualize alongside me. If you're watching this on YouTube, we play pawn takes bishop on e5. Black takes our bishop. We take black's knight. But remember, our knight is now on e2, so black is able to take on e2. And then there's a queen trade that's possible, but black could then continue and take the rook with checks. I'll show you after the game. But the complications, I think, work out for black. And so we're going to sidestep them. There's no reason to go into it. We go bishop g5. And now I think we're ready to play f4. Okay, obviously, we play bishop h4, dropping the bishop back. g5 here is a very weakening move. And we can then use that pawn as a hook to push f4. Black plays queen e8. Okay. It's a pretty advanced move. Getting out of the pin, that's a good move. Okay, so we've got a couple things that we can do at this point. We can play a sort of vanilla move, like, yeah, let's play queen d2, right? So this is just a kind of instinctive move that coordinates the rooks. It also links the queen with the knight, so now bishop takes c3 is not a dangerous move at all. I'll also notice this very important detail. Bishop takes c3, queen takes c3, knight takes e4, the c7 pawn hangs. So as soon as a piece moves away from a square, I immediately, in like 5-6 seconds, do a quick scan of the board to see which pawns and pieces are now slightly more vulnerable. Okay, knight to g4 doesn't make much sense to me. I don't understand why we can't just chase the knight away with h3, because knight h2 is the road to hell, although it is paved with good intentions. We're just going to move our rook away, and the knight's going to be trapped. Bishop h2 check, just king h1. So this is the kind of an impulsive move that's really common at this level. Yeah, black has to go back to f6, but that's not an easy move to make emotionally, as you guys know. Queen to e6. Okay, so our opponent is completely losing track of the game here. That just gives up the knight. We'll gladly capture it. Okay, so I can see what our opponent is going for. I think he's trying to claim that our bishop is somewhat trapped on h4, but first of all, it's not even close to being trapped. It's got multiple squares it can go to. And in a situation like this, the thing to do is to choose the simplest continuation. You want to avoid unnecessary complications. So what would unnecessary complications look like? I think the move bishop to e7 is precisely the move that I would avoid, because it gets messy, right? Black can maybe drop the queen back to h5 and threaten checkmate. After rook e8, we have to find another square for the bishop, and then potentially we walk into d6. There is a much easier move, and it's not pawn to g3, because then the bishop is actually trapped after g5. Don't be greedy and realize that you're up an entire minor piece, so you can shed another pawn, but in return, you get rid of black's only developed minor piece. Your king becomes entirely safe, and as part of the package, you get the semi-open f-file, and as you should already know from all my Gleck games, that's a pretty big deal in these types of positions. But even if you didn't get the semi-open f-file, the fact that you get rid of this bishop is worth the sacrifice of another pawn. Our opponent doesn't even capture it. He goes d6. Again, simple chess. Let's just get rid of this bishop. And there's a million roads that lead to Rome after black takes. There's multiple approaches to winning a position like this. And so the way that I play isn't necessarily the best way. It's just one of the many ways that you can convert the minor piece. I'm going to try to go for the trading approach. I'm going to try to initiate a series of trades because the center is open. The queen on g4 is vulnerable. And when I say that the queen is vulnerable, you might immediately start thinking about moves like f3 or bishop b2. But again, don't fall for one move-itis. Those are just one-move threats that don't really accomplish anything. Knight to d5 is an excellent move here, but you should have a response to c6 already prepared in your mind. There we could go knight e7, take c8. But the move I really like is f4. And this is not an aggressive move. It's an attempt to simplify the game. After e takes f4, we're going to take back with the queen, and we're going to use the semi-open f-file as leverage to try to encourage a queen trade. Black plays f6. That plays right into our hands. At this point, we can just start swapping pieces. F takes e5. And we put our Russian schoolboy hats on. Okay, actually, we don't put our Russian schoolboy hats on. We put our tactical hats on because if black recaptures, we get a really cool tactic. If I'm seeing it correctly. Yeah. Ooh. Potentially. Okay, f5. It seems our opponent is not really in the business of recapturing any pieces. Okay, so here again, there's a million ways we could play. We could just play e takes f5. But I'm really partial to this check on c4 and then just pushing the e-pawn up to e6. Because obviously black's queenside is undeveloped, so you could try to exploit that and win the game faster. Just be flexible in your approach. Yeah, bishop c4 and e6. Nothing to calculate here. F takes e4 is not possible. The rook hangs. Black might play f4. These are not very serious threats. They're easy to deal with. And Okay, this type of situation, it's a good idea to ask yourself what your next move is going to be, just to have a sense of the roadmap. Like, how are you actually going to win? And here we're already creating a concrete threat. We're threatening to play e7, but after rook e8, I know a lot of you might be excited about this concept, queen to d8. I actually think queen d8 is a false friend. It's a mistake. Who can tell me why queen d8 in that position? Okay, our opponent is tilting, but I guess we'll have to wait until after the game, which is already after the game. So let's say black plays a random move. Here, you don't just want to blindly apply tactical concepts because that's how you get in trouble. You need to calculate, like queen d8, right? Looks great, but notice that black's rooks are both kind of defending the e8 square. So black has this move bishop to e6, connecting the rooks and actually attacking the queen. Bishop e6, rook d8. White is still better because white has a bunch of stuff for the queen, but here you have to win all over again. So what is the correct way to convert in this position? What is the actual winning move for white? It's not queen to d8. It is bishop to f7, hitting the rook and clearing the d8 square, and this is actually just checkmate. Yeah, very good. So the dangers of just kind of blindly applying pattern recognition, you have to look at the concrete position before you play the textbook move. If I were black, I would play f4 here, but that doesn't actually change anything. We can go e7 and bishop f7 anyway. I suppose black can play bishop to d7 and give away another exchange, but obviously this is just game over. So pretty easy game. Where did things go wrong for our opponent? So first of all, bishop c5 is an inaccuracy, and I wanted to quickly explain this knight e2 move that I mentioned. So first of all, where else do we see this concept? So in the actual Gleck system, if black plays knight f6, we play g3. In the Gleck system, we see both the center counter trick and this knight e2 concept. So black plays bishop c5. This is one of the two most popular moves. The other one is d5. I won't go into the theory in this video. We play bishop g2. And here, as I've explained many times, castle's kingside is a mistake because it walks into this knight takes e5 trick. And after knight e5, d4, we get a very similar sequence of moves to the game, except after we castle and black plays d6, here knight e2 is an extremely strong move. In basketball, this is kind of a concept that is referred to as pulling the chair out, where, okay, this is a slightly obscure sports reference, but if one player is posting up another, the other player just quickly moves out of the way, causing the player who's doing the posting up to travel, to essentially take a bunch of steps and fall down. This is what's happening to the bishop, right? The bishop's chilling because it always has this bailout. Suddenly, you're like, wait, it doesn't have the bailout anymore. We're threatening to trap it with f4. And what's the big difference? The difference is that black does not have the d5 move because of e takes d5. And you're up a pawn, the bishop is protecting it. By the way, f4 is less accurate here. Remember that black always has this check saving the minor piece. So don't get too excited in this position. You just win a pawn and then you can support it with c4. If you compare to the game continuation, here it's a little bit of a different story, obviously, because our bishop is on d3, it's not on g2. So after d5, e takes d5 just doesn't really cut it after knight takes d5. And if you play f4, apart from bishop to d6, which is still possible, black has this very nasty counter, d takes e4. And this is the line that I was rattling off during the game. Takes, 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 and white has to play queen takes e2. Queen takes d8 doesn't make sense, even because of rook takes d8, but black has the further intermezzo, ef1 and rook d8. Black is up a rook, so we're going to have to play queen takes e2. Black can play gf, and I wasn't convinced that white is that much better here. Even though it may seem like black's king is weak, you might get excited about this move. Maybe white is doing well here, but I wouldn't be too confident. Rook e8. Actually, here white has a really sexy move. Who can, now that we've reached this position, I'm seeing a very, very nasty resource. That might change the evaluation. It's actually not queen f3, although queen f3 and trying to get the queen to g3 is a good call. Queen g4 doesn't work. The bishop controls that square. It's actually rook a to d1. This is a worthwhile trick to remember, rook a d1. And just let your eyes kind of settle onto this position. If black takes the queen, you take the queen with checkmate, and black's queen suddenly has nowhere to move because queen e7, you just trade, and then again, rook d8 is mate. I'm actually doing a quick search for this concept. See if I can actually find any examples of it in real life. Yeah, okay, I'll do some more research because I like to illustrate these ideas. But rook a1 is really nice. Black, I suppose, does have bishop d7, and white maintains a very strong attack. But the other problem is that black can actually play bishop d6 here, and maybe this is even a better move. Because again, if white plays e5, black gives a check. You might be like, but isn't this pawn chain impressive? Well, yeah, it is, but black actually has some very strong minor pieces, so it counterbalances itself. And again, notice that I'm playing practically. Why would you get into these complications when you have a very simple and very powerful developing move? And if you're a newer player, you should be making sure that it makes sense to you why this is not like a scary or a bad outcome for white. It's because the benefits of the bishop pair and this pin outweigh the largely irrelevant damage to the queenside pawns, which is not really going to become important for a very long time. So black played h6. Black played a nice move, queen e8, getting out of the pin. We coordinated our rooks. And of course, like here, things start to go wrong for black. Probably black should play... Black's position is pretty bad here. Probably black should play d6. But we have a lot of options. We could even consider f4, kind of the most aggressive option. This check is not scary. The bishop is really awkward here. And if black plays takes and takes, again, we take on c7. Black is in huge trouble. The rook is coming in. Bishop e7 is a threat, trapping this rook in the corner. This is obviously very, very bad. So black played knight g4. We chased away the knight. And bishop g3, another instructive move, giving away a pawn. If black had captured twice, what would be kind of consistent with our strategy, but also try to find the best move? I think there is a Russian schoolboy move here that you could play, but then there's also a very powerful tactical move you could play. See if you can find both of them. So the schoolboy move is queen f4, basically forcing the queen trade because this pawn is not a pawn black can afford to lose. And so you trade queens and you convert the endgame. The tactical move is bishop to c4. What threat does this set up? Let's say black plays d6. Boom, rook f7, another very typical tactical concept, rook f1, and the rook on f7 will be recaptured with interest. This is what we actually would have played. So just to illustrate how many different ways there are to convert a position like this. Yeah, rook f3 is also very decent. Could you sack it first? Could you play rook f7 here? No, because here black has a chance to either get out of the pin with king f8, and now the rook can move. Maybe white is still winning, but I wouldn't bother with this. Or another concept is like c6, preparing d5, trying to intercept the pin. So that's why I would start with bishop c4, setup move. And you might be like, well, what if black plays bishop c4, c6, trying to anticipate rook f7? Well, then we're not going to play rook f7 anymore. Here, we might go back to queen f4. We might play rook f3 and rook f1. A lot of things we could do. We're totally winning. So anyways, f4. And last thing I'll mention, f takes e5. We had a very cool tactic here. Now, a lot of you are like, bishop c4, the game is over, but it's not over just yet. Black can block with the bishop. And again, the Soviet schoolboy inside of me is like, okay, just trade all the pieces and win easily. But who can spot the kind of sick move that wins even faster? Queen d7. Excellent. Using the pins. This is a double pin move. Queen is untouchable. It's illegal. Black takes the bishop. The queen hangs. And the bishop on e6 is under fire. So this is what I was hoping would happen. So that is the key to... Yeah, here we just push e6 and the game is over. Yeah, black can survive with rook e8, but not for long. Okay, let's do one more 5-minute game, which is slightly faster paced and we're higher rated. So we're going to get some more high-level openings. We have black here and hopefully another Najdorf. Okay, we have another kind of semi-Bowdler attack. This is a better version of the Bowdler attack. A lot of people at the beginner levels, they tend to play bishop c4 immediately. This is a somewhat improved version, but still very innocuous. We faced it many times, so we play knight f6 here. And white castles kingside. So weird choice by our opponent, sacrificing the e-pawn, and I see no reason we can't just capture it. Yeah, d3. Okay, let's go back to f6. We're just kind of making only moves. Okay, our opponent is clearly not in their right mind. Knight g5. Now, we faced these types of sacrifices, and if you're like 1600, this kind of stuff, it should not be scary to you anymore, and you should know how to react to it. Right, so you choose basically the safest spot for the king, which is sometimes going to be going back to the center But generally, if there is a spot on the king side, that is the one that you should choose. So here, king g8 is a safer move. Now, whenever the king is on g8 like this, you have to make sure that you're not getting mated along this diagonal. So sometimes, like if white would have a pawn already on c3, you have to make sure that a move like queen b3 check isn't going to kill you. But here it's not going to kill us because we can block with d5. Queen e2 doesn't create any threats, but watch how I convert this position. Knight e6, is this something we want to allow? It's totally innocuous. So one good move here would be to play e5. Even innocuous moves should be prevented if they're kind of annoying. But there's a tactical way to prevent knight e6, which is actually to ignore the threat. Of course, it's not really a threat. But who can spot a cool little simplifying resource is what I would call it. What was the actual point of knight c6? Of course, there's nothing wrong with queen d7. Definitely don't take the knight and get mated in one move. But of course, knight to d4 was the actual point here. Hitting the queen, forcing the knight trade. Simple. Simple and strong. And it keeps the bishop pair alive. And it also, after we recapture on d4, it prevents white from developing their knight, making it hard to continue the initiative. Now we play as though we were not up a piece, right? So what is the big priority in our position? We haven't completed our development, and we're actually not even close to completing our development. We need to do that quickly and efficiently with an eye toward ensuring that our kings remain safe. So if I want to be super pedantic, e5, I think, is actually an inaccuracy. Not because it creates the pin. I don't care about the pin. The knight is very safe. It's because it creates a target that white can use to try to blast open the position. e5, f4 creates some slight annoyances for our position. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to start with h6. I'm going to see where this bishop goes. Just a useful move. Also encouraging the trade, which is obviously helpful for us. Okay, fantastic. Thank you. I'm going to take away from the center. What is the reason I'm taking away from the center? Well, g takes f6 is a very weakening move. It weakens the king a little bit further. Also, e takes f6 opens up the diagonal for this bishop. Why is that important? Well, it's important because now we can push d5 and get this bishop out, and we've preserved our bishop pair. Yes, we're going to have to give away the d4 pawn, but again, that's a very small price to pay for total coordination. So now let's get this bishop out to a nice little square. Let's ensure the permanent safety of the king. The king on g8 is very awkwardly placed. It's blocking in the rook. Let's get it to a nice, secure location on h7. And let's get this rook involved, and let's start converting our extra piece. Okay, so again, broadly speaking, we're going to have two different methods for how to convert this extra piece. There's going to be the Soviet schoolboy method, and then there's going to be the direct head-on, let's keep the queens on the board and go for the attack. The Soviet schoolboy method would advocate for a very powerful, very deep move, which looks like a blunder, and that's the move queen to e8. Looks like a blunder because we're hanging the d5 pawn, but that's a strategic sacrifice. Who can explain why? What is the natural follow-up? And this should be very obvious to you. Queen e5, forcing the queen trade. Forcing the queen trade. Yeah. Queen e4 check. That's a nicely played move by our opponent. But let's be accurate, right? If we take the queen, we let white improve their pawn structure. Also, what you should notice is the point is if white takes on e5, we take back with a bishop, and potentially we win the pawn on b2. So f5 is very accurate. Now, queen h4, is that scary? Who spotted this move and actually had the response prepared? Hopefully all of you. Well, the queen is clearly overloaded, right? It has these two assignments. So we go g5 and we win another piece. Queen h5, queen takes d4, queen f7. Is that checkmate? Nope. Queen drops back to g7. So calculation always has to underpin these types of operations. Queen f2. Okay, now let's just trade. And the game's, and we can also pick up the exchange and win the game. There's no rush to take the rook. We can take the rook. We can wait. Now we should take the rook. Again, this is the concept from the previous game. White wants to play d4, so don't fall asleep. Now finishing the development and getting the rook to the only open file. And now the simplest way to win is just to double on the file. White's going to resign. GG. Yeah, pretty boring game, but still had some instructive themes. This type of stuff doesn't fly at the 1500 level. You know, these bishop f7 tricks. At least they shouldn't. Yeah, castles is already very bad. if I was trying to make this work for white, I would probably go d4, try to open up the center. It's still not dangerous at all. We could even play c takes d4. We could play d5 and kind of meet white at the top. But white played rook d3, which made no sense. It helps our knight get back to home base. And now just giving up an entire piece. The only thing that you should avoid here is a move like king g6. Obviously, this is the least safe square because it could also get checkmated with a pawn. But notice how I converted this. Knight c6. Your default is just to continue developing. And I was avoiding the move e5 because I didn't want to allow white to open up more files with f4. Right? Anytime you push a pawn, you create a potential hook. Now, would this be an existential problem for us? Absolutely not. We could just go knight c6 and keep the center relatively closed. We're still completely winning. Takes, and whatever, h6, bishop g4. There are many, many ways to convert, but this forces the trade. Now the move h6, creating another Luft square for the king, encouraging the trade. So don't be afraid to strategically give away pawns if you're up a minor piece, but also don't overdo it. And I've seen this happen a lot, where a player finds a way to force the queen trade and doesn't realize how many pawns they're actually giving away in order to get those queens off the board. If you're giving away like 3 pawns, remember that your opponent actually might then have full compensation in the endgame. So it's kind of a balance, right? Here we're giving away 1 pawn to get our pieces out, and then we're giving away another pawn, but we're not really giving away another pawn. We're giving away this pawn temporarily because after the trade, white loses the pawn back, which is quite important. I wouldn't really go into this endgame if white could keep both pawns alive. So here, if the knight moves, we capture b2, and if white goes c3, we trade off another pair, and obviously these pawns are sitting ducks, and we can pick them up pretty easily with our rook and then our bishop. Why not queen b6 to save the pawn? Asks JMac. Where? Queen b6 to save the pawn. At this point, queen b6? Just if you can indicate the specific moment you thought we should play queen b6. Earlier, queen b6. Oh, here, queen b6. Well, okay, first of all, I was prioritizing development. Second of all, again, I don't want to allow a move like queen e8. So this is going to cause us some headaches. Probably not major headaches. We can go king h7 and get the bishop out. But I was just sort of adhering to the general strategy, right? We don't really need this pawn. Trying to keep this pawn might cause us to allow counterplay on other sides of the board. Like maybe we're allowing like a4, a5, and if you have to play a5, then the queen is undefended. You kind of see what I'm saying? Is it really worth doing this just to keep this useless pawn when instead you can solve all these other problems in your position and things don't really change just because you've given away that one pawn? So this is what technical intuition is, right? When you try to get better at converting, making decisions like these is what conversion is all about. And sometimes you're going to make the wrong decision. You're going to give away too much material to trade queens or the opposite. Nobody's perfect, but hopefully you can see how my decision process happened here. Okay, one more game. This one was pretty anticlimactic. Krupnov. Okay, let's go. E4, C5, and okay, I'm trying to remember what I recommend. Okay, I still recommend the Alapin. And e6. Okay, so this is a very popular move at the higher levels. C takes d4 is already inaccurate. The proper way to play here is the immediate d5, and then white has this choice, right? White can play e5 and get into an advanced French, or white can play this more in Alapin spirit and play e takes d5. I'll give you a little bit of theoretical grounding after the game, but our opponent is not going down the kind of typical theoretical path, knight to f6. Okay, so the one big thing to remember here is not to rush the move e5, because that just gives away the d5 square. And you would technically transpose to like a mainline Alapin, but there's no reason to do that because just by playing knight to c3, you're keeping control of all these important squares. And this is not a move to be scared of at all. e5 would be the instinctive reaction of a lot of people, like this pawn is under attack, we need to solve it. But the way you should try to approach this is, how can I develop my pieces with an eye toward aiming them at my opponent's king while also protecting the e4 pawn? Some of you might think, what about bishop to g5? I've talked about this type of move before. It's not a good way to keep this pawn protected because black can just start chasing your bishop away. The better move here is bishop to d3, of course. In the event that black castles, at some point we will play e5 and open up the diagonal, but the time for that is not now. Now, the situation has changed quite a bit. So what move looks a lot better than it did on the previous move? So we could play knight f3 or knight e2. We could play a3, although I wouldn't play a3 because black might end up taking on c3 anyway, so why are we wasting a move encouraging them to do that? I actually really like bishop g5 here because this pin is very problematic. Now bishop h4, we're trying, yep, great, fantastic. Now black has created a potentially fatal weakness on the king side. And what our opponent is doing is just creating one move threats. And eventually our opponent's going to run out of one move threats and we're going to turn our attention to the king. So what is the nicest, most clinical way to defend against the threat of bishop takes knight? Yeah, knight e2, very good. Knight e2, not knight g2, by the way, just a technical clarification. This is referred to as knight e2 because the other knight is pinned and could not access e2. d5. Our opponent continues in the same spirit. And now, yeah, the obvious response to this is e5. So we'll play that. And now the watershed moment. This is where our defense turns into offense. It's time for us to transition to a direct attack against black's king. And to do that, we should solve one last problem. We should try to somehow defend the knight on c3. But there is a tempo way to do that, right? We can do that in a way where we then have an opportunity to start the attack. I'm describing this awkwardly. I'm just talking about taking the knight. You might say, well, isn't this bishop a big attacking asset? It is, right? We're giving away an important attacker, but in return, we're getting an opportunity to finally start our attack. Now, what does it mean to start the attack here? Well, we have a very clear target. We have this g5 pawn. This is referred to as a hook. A hook is a pawn that you can use to more easily open up files for your heavy pieces. So it would be a mistake here from an attacking standpoint to castle kingside. That's a great move. You would probably win the e4 pawn, but we're playing for checkmate here. So how do you use this pawn as a hook? Well, f4 is not the smartest way because black can actually take on passant. The smartest way to do it is h4. We're trying to open up the h file, and ultimately that is where we will try to checkmate black. Black plays g4, trying to keep the king side closed. But as a result of the move g4, what I'm noticing is that this diagonal has opened up. So this h6 pawn is the one that I have my sights on. Let's attack it. Let's play queen d2. This is also just a useful move in general. This is what you're trying to aim for when you're attacking. Okay, so it doesn't really matter which piece we take with. We can play knight c3 just to maintain an attacker on this pawn. And now, many, many roads lead to Rome, but the most consistent is either to involve the queen, or if you want to play kind of mature chess, you can play this move h5, which is what I'm going to do. What is the actual point of the move h5? What are we setting up? And it's not it's not a vague concept, but it's not like, oh, we're trying to fix the weakness. A lot of you might think it's bishop f4, but it's not. It's not bishop f4 that we're trying to set up because bishop f4, just rook h8 is a dead end. It's actually rook to h4. Rook to h4. And suddenly, black can't defend this pawn, and we're involving the rook in the attack. This is why we didn't castle kingside. Now we take. And now, again, many ways to complete the game. But in a low time situation, you want to kind of bank a couple of pawns so that if the attack doesn't work out, you're still winning. Now, let's get this bishop into the game. Bishop h4, stopping the rook from coming to d8 and also getting ready to stick this bishop on f6. That's going to set up some mating themes. Our opponent goes rook h7. We go bishop f6. And now we're going to start hunting for this rook because this rook is out of squares. So immediately I'm looking at this rook. I'm saying it's out of squares. How could we attack this rook? Well, we can't attack it on the next move. But we can attack it via this diagonal. To attack it via this diagonal, we would have to get this rook out of the way, which we kind of want to do anyway, because this sets up the threat of rook g8, stops the black king from escaping any further. Now, we could probably get away with queen d3. Let's try to calculate queen d3, bc, queen h7, cb check, king to e2. Black plays queen b5 check. We play king f3. And we win the game. Let's do it. In bc, we could even play bc. There's really no rush, but this is the scientific way to win because black is going to run out of checks. Now, I wouldn't really recommend this method to... Wait, where's the mate? Okay, there's a million ways to mate, but just in the interest of beauty, let's give a check. And let's give this check just to say that we sacrifice the queen and rook takes g8 as mate. Okay, so I let my time run down there a little bit, but I wanted to explain how I was thinking about the attack. So as you can see, in the last two games were 5-minute games. We're still at the level where people are not very good against the Alapin. So again, just to continue my lobbying for opening knowledge, especially at the beginner, at the intermediate level, you should be, doing your chessable work, and you should know like at least 6, 7 moves in every line that you're learning. Just a second. So let's talk about theory. Let me give you a little bit of an overview. The C6 variation. We've obviously faced this a million times in the speedrun. In previous speedruns, we've also faced C takes D4. We've basically faced everything. But the serious move here is D5. And here you have a choice. Now, originally, I recommended people to take on D5, but my opinion has sort of changed. I actually think that playing into the advanced French is a pretty smart thing to do for 2 reasons. The first is that your opponents are often going to be bluffing. They're going to be hoping that you don't know the advance because they're not necessarily French players. Like, in fact, most of them are not. They're Sicilian players. So they're going to be hoping for E takes D5. And here, E takes D5 is kind of an annoying line. Who can tell me what typical structure you often get in this variation? And I'm looking for 3 letters. Like in this specific line of the Alapin, you often get this. 99% of the time you're going to get this structure. So IQP, you're going to get an IQP. And if you're white, you're going to be playing against an isolated queen pawn. So here the main line is knight F3. There's no rush to take on C5. Black typically plays knight F6. And traditionally in sort of the earlier Alapin books from a couple years ago, it was always thought that white is better here. And I think the sort of traditional way to get an advantage was always considered bishop B5 check, bishop D7, you trade, and after castles, bishop B7, this is sort of the old main line, DC, knight C5. This position was evaluated as a slight advantage for white for a very long time because it looks like a slight advantage for white. If you kind of know about IQP structures, you have this complete control of the square in front of the pawn. But with modern engines, it turns out black is actually totally fine because black's pieces are very active. I'm not going to get into the reasons why. You could do some analysis on your own. But if black knows what they're doing, white doesn't have much of an advantage. So in some of the recent chessable courses on the Alapin, you had some kind of creative options being offered. I think that one course gave some alternative like bishop to G5 is interesting in this position. So you could do a little bit of research, but my recommendation is actually to go into the advance and to learn the advance, which is a very dangerous line against the French. If you learn the advance as a bonus, well, then you could actually play it against the sort of traditional French move order. What specific line within the advance do I recommend? I really think Gawain Jones has a great set of recommendations in the advance. He recommends this gambit line that people hate playing against. So C5, C3 main line, knight C6, knight F3. Now you're going to have to do like a good amount of studying if you want to learn the advance, because what is black's main move? Who knows what black's most popular sort of traditional main line is here? This is, in the database, the most popular move by like 200,000 games. It's queen to B6. The second most popular is bishop to D7. And the third most popular move, which has been really, really hot lately, is knight Ge7. A lot of like GMs are playing this move partially to avoid the Jones recommendation. So what Gawain Jones recommends is queen B6. The most popular move here is A3, trying to go for B4. And this leads to some very, very like theoretical, like crazy positions. But there's this old move, bishop to D3, that has been revived recently. Bishop to D3. And when black plays C takes D4, you actually don't recapture, right? So you might think that this is automatic, and this is not a pawn sack because black can't play knight takes D4. This is the classic idea. The problem with recapturing is that it's just a dead end if black knows how to respond. If black knows the move bishop D7 here, white has no advantage. In fact, white is fighting for equality. And if white castles and sacrifices the pawn, which is called the Milner-Berry gambit, this is interesting, and there's definitely some kind of meat on the bone. Like you can do some research here and find some dangerous lines, but white is worse. So Jones recommends actually castling in this position instead of recapturing on D4. And this is the line that I recommend to people. This is a very, very dangerous line, even if black does their kind of due diligence. And the point is that after DC3, you're already much better because you recapture with the knight, and that knight is potentially heading to this juicy outpost on D6. Now, most people who get this position, they play A6 because they get scared of that knight jump. Now you get the bishop out to E3. And here there's a very cool detail. If black plays D4, who can tell me how white should respond to this move? Slight trick question if I know how people think. White is already winning, by the way. with proper play. So a lot of you might be instinctually inclined to play knight a4, but that is not the best move. The best move is actually just to take on d4. Using the same theme I just talked about, you can just take, and black can't take back because of this discovery winning the queen. So after bishop e3, black is in huge trouble. Black has to drop the queen back to d8. You can't play bishop c5 because of this knight a4 fork. So black has to go back. Now you actually play knight a4 anyway, aiming for the b6 square. So let's say black plays b5. Now the knight gets into b6, eliminating the bishop. You might be like, but isn't it a bad idea to trade off the French bishop? But here, white has such a big development advantage that now you can exploit this weak pawn on b5 and go a4, and it's already like +3. Black is just horribly underdeveloped. Now, someone was asking, what about queen takes b2? Queen takes b2, you still play knight a4, and this is even stronger. Let's say queen b4. You could throw in the move rook to b1. If queen a5, you actually trap the queen by sticking the bishop on b6. And if the queen moves up to a3, I think the computer move here is queen to c2, which may seem to walk into knight b4, but actually you play rook takes b4. After bishop takes b4, obviously these pieces can be exploited. You also have the beautiful bishop c1 trapping the queen, which is really lovely. I like these types of retreating moves. And if queen takes b4, then you do go knight b6, rook b8, queen c7, 1-0. Everything's falling apart. So really, really cool sacrifice. Now, not everybody's going to play DC, which is a mistake. Black is supposed to play bishop to d7 here. This is what the people in the know do. Now you play rook to e1. You basically keep the tension. And you're kind of inviting black to play DC, which allows you to get this huge lead in development. Now, black is going to be like, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to go knight ge7. But there's a lot of pitfalls on the way. Like most people at the intermediate level, they don't really know this line well. So they're going to make a mistake early. Either they're going to go DC or they're going to go bishop c5 and walk into b4, which is really, really bad for black because now you have to go back and white pushes b5 and is able to recover the pawn with the knight, which is really good because now the queen has access to g4 and black is essentially stuck in mud. So black has to know knight g7. And does anybody actually know what Jones recommends in this position? This is a very important move. And this is where I'll kind of stop my theoretical overview. It's a prophylactic move, actually. It's a pure, simple prophylaxis if you understand what black wants. The move is h4. The move is h4. How is it a prophylactic move? Well, it prevents the completion of the maneuver knight g6 because now you can just send the knight back with h5. Of course, your instinctive question might be, well, what if black plays h5? Well, if black plays h5, you're supposed to go knight a3, and you've also prevented knight g6 because here, well, here you can play bishop takes g6 and completely ruin black's structure. But actually, I think the clinical move is to play cd, and only after knight d4, you play knight d4. And actually, you go for a different, very nasty concept. The knight gets to b5. It's a very typical idea. Queen b6, again, bringing the bishop out with tempo. And once the queen drops back to d8, at some point, you're going to play bishop takes g6. So the inclusion of these two moves are squarely in white's favor because you get this additional option of taking on g6, and black will never really be able to go kingside. So after h4, white, again, black has to know like a bunch of moves in order to equalize, and I've had amazing results with this online. H6 is the best move according to the engine. And here, knight b to d2 is, I think, a really strong and a really rare move. And you could do a lot of the research yourself. I won't reveal all of my findings, but this is really interesting because you're like, well, doesn't this allow DC? But BC has its own benefits because the B file opens up, the knight can get into B3, and black just has a very hard time untangling in the center. So a lot of people, they go like knight A5 here and try to stop knight B3, but you can go knight B3 anyway. And if black trades, I think you're kind of getting the gist of it. A takes B5. Again, black has this problem with the knight on E7. Can try to put it on C6, but now you're going to get major queenside pressure. You're going to play B4, stopping bishop C5. Then the bishop comes out to E3. The pawn advances to B5. You have H5. And it's really unpleasant. Bishop E7. You can go bishop E3, chasing away the queen. Queen drops back to C7. Now you can go bishop back to D2, making sure that the pawn on E5 is protected. And the point I'm trying to make is that if black castles kingside, you could throw in B5, and now bishop to B1 is incredibly strong, setting up this battery black has no good way to stop it. Because anytime black plays g6, not only does the h6 pawn hang, but you also have h5 just shattering the kingside completely. So hopefully white's play is making some degree of sense. I would encourage you to do some research on your own, but I actually think the advance at most levels is really, really good, a really good time investment to learn the advanced. This is, I think, part of the reason that a lot of people are going bishop d7, but this doesn't solve all of black's problems. And here I think the best move is bishop to e2, but I'll save this for another day because I'm sure we'll get some advanced Frenches in the speedrun. The way our opponent played it is bad, and black should play d5 here, but this is a bad version of the advanced. Why is it a bad version of the advanced? Who can explain conceptually why it's a bad idea for black to exchange on d4? And it's important to know these things because then you're able to... It's not enough to know that something is bad. You have to understand why it's bad on sort of a general conceptual level. It's because it gives white the additional c3 square for the knight, right? So black plays this the same way as a regular French, for like knight c6, knight f3. Let's say black assumes that this is a regular French. This doesn't make sense because white is able to just develop normally with knight c3. So the way that most people play this position is they go, well, knight g7 is the engine move, and some GMs have tried this line. Now white is supposed to play knight to a3. This move you should remember. And the point is, after knight f5, the knight gets back to c2. Very nice overprotection of the d4 pawn, and black's play kind of runs out of steam. So bishop b7, for example, we get the bishop to d3. Castles, castles, and white has a small but very, very nice advantage because black has no good way to increase the pressure on d4. One thing I would advise you is that you should not rush to take this knight on f5. If you're a French player with black, you kind of know that this structure is pretty good for black because you're giving the bishop this kind of really nice blockading square on e6, and it's very hard for white to generate play without the light squared bishop, even though it might look visually unappealing for black. So don't rush to take on f5. Of course, like under certain circumstances, you do want to take on f5. Black typically tries to play this very standard French move f6, but you can reinforce the e5 pawn with bishop f4. And yeah, g5 here is a move that you should know. The bishop drops back to d2. F takes c5, you go knight takes c5, and if black plays g4, well, now you go ef6, hitting the bishop, and now knight e5. So oftentimes when black tries to go after you on the king side, it's not going to work out because black has not enough of a stable foundation, not enough development. So that's enough theory. I think I'm giving people a headache. Suffice it to say that here you've got a worse version of the advanced French, and you should remember this knight a3, knight c2 maneuver. Last thing I'll point out, in the database, the most popular move here is bishop to b4 check, but this is not a scary check at all. It merely encourages the move that you want to play anyway, which is knight c3. And after knight g7, again, you develop along the same lines, bishop to d3, and if black castles, of course, here you should not forget about the Greek gift sacrifice. I'm literally seeing like 55 games in my database with this classic version of the Greek gift. So anyways, our opponent played without d5, and again without d5, and this is a very bad way to play. Because here we get like the perfect development scheme, and we're able to get our bishop to g5, threatening the move e5. So with the way our opponent plays it, loses pretty quickly. I think already after like knight e2, our position is borderline winning from a practical standpoint. And what I would kind of draw your attention to is this moment after knight e4. This is where I think a lot of people would either play a move like queen c2, which allows black a chance to complete their development, or would take on e4, but now not realize that it's the time for h4. They would castle, and here the game will drag on a lot longer, even though white is still pretty much winning. All right, so h4, using the pawn as a hook. That is the big takeaway. g4 is a heads-up move by our opponent, but anytime pawns are pushed on the side of the board where you're attacking, generally diagonals and avenues are going to open, and you're going to want to pay attention to that. Because here, if black plays h5, the queen gets in and just eliminates all the pawns. So black played bishop takes c3. We took back with the knight, although we could have taken to the pawn. And now another money concept, h5. Setting up this rook h4 idea, Let me see if I can quickly find an example of this. Ooh, here's a juicy illustration. So this is a game, a Sicilian Sveshnikov gone wrong. Pretty strong players from 1978. Watch how white attacks and finishes off the attack. Really, we won't stop on any of the. We won't delve too deeply, but just watch how white does it. White plays h4, pretty natural move. Now drops the queen back. The h pawn marches forward. You're threatening h6, and now the maneuver from our game, rook h4. So slightly different execution, but the same concept. Queen drops back to make space for the rook. And now you reach a point where you're like, okay, what the heck do I do now? And I've talked about this. When you get to the what the heck do I do now point in the attack, you should consider the sacrifices, but here they don't work, right? None of this type of shenanigans work. So oftentimes strong players immediately transition to the other side of the board and try to create more problems for the opponent. So who can make an educated guess at the best move for white? So if you notice this arrangement of pawns, this is kind of screaming for a breakthrough. But you don't want to go c5 immediately because black will just take it with the queen. And then you might say, well, don't we open the c file? Isn't that a good thing? Well, that's not really a good thing. How are we going to use the c file? So let's be more patient. Rook to c1 is a much better move. Because if black ignores the threat, now c5 is really strong because now we get the breakthrough in its kind of pure form. So black doesn't sleep. Black plays rook a6, which is a really nice defensive move. The point is here you don't really have d6 anymore. But white is patient. White plays bishop f5, trying to get this very favorable trade and get the knight into f5, which would win the game. Black says nope. White centralizes the queen, moves it back to d3, reinforcing the threat of c5, forcing black to dedicate another defender to the queen side. And now knight f1, queen f3 to protect the f2 pawn, and the knight circles around to e4, which is like the perfect attacking square, where not only will the knight participate in the attack, but also finally we're able to get through c5 and crash through on the c file, crash through with a pawn. And now look at how the game ends. Bishop h7, and who can spot the final move of the game? This is amazing attacking play by white. He was a really strong player. I am from the Netherlands, still alive. The cherry on top, not rook g7, although this should win the game. It's not the fastest. Rook g7, I'll play king g7, and you still have some work to do. The move is queen f6. This is actually why white pushed the pawn up to d6. It was to take away the e7 square from black's king. So bishop f6, rook g8 is mate. What a game. And if black tries to defend the bishop, then queen e7 is mate. So the d6 pawn is implicated. Really instructive attack, but it was all started by this rook maneuver, similarly to our game. Just to wrap up here. Yeah, here we have a simpler concept behind it, which is we just want to win the g-pawn. But we don't just want to win the g-pawn. We want to involve the rook in the attack. And again, notice that we're not... the point is not to prevent black from playing h5 here, because h5 was never a problem for us because it gave away the g5 square. The point is literally to open up this avenue for the rook. Also, anytime black plays f5, you have en passant. Very important that we have that. We win the pawn. We win another pawn. Now we kind of do what white did in the game I just showed you. Just make some improving moves. Get the bishop to the ideal square. Identify the target that we want to use in order to infiltrate. And then just do it. Here, very important. We're not moving the king to the first rank because black takes with check. We need to get the king out of the line of fire. And the most resilient move here was queen a6 check. But how can we evade the checks here? Last question to people before I wrap up for the night, wrap up this episode. How does white get out of the checking zone, which is harder to do than it seems? There's a lot of tricks and traps that you can actually fall into in these types of situations. Actually, the best move is king e3. The piece of advice I've heard is that you want to get out of the knight checks first and foremost, because knight checks can be really nasty, because they can open the door to more nasty checks. So you get out of the knight check, queen a3 check, and now you get out of the queen checks, just kind of identifying the safe square is another good method of quickly understanding where you want to go. You definitely don't want to go kind of in the direction of the majority of the checks. Like you don't want to do this because first of all, black can under promote. Also, you're opening yourself up to like a million different checks and desperados and sacrifices. So if you can avoid this type of scenario, you should. But here I calculated precisely to ensure that we're not walking into one of these weird shenanigans. And that's how I will end the speedrun, folks. Thanks everybody for watching. Hope you enjoyed. I will get some rest before the Hyperbullet qualifiers tomorrow, which I might stream. But I hope you enjoyed, even though we had some 5-minute games. Thanks, everybody. I will send you over to Joe Bruin, and I'll see you guys later. Thanks, everybody. Bye.